Now, with the second New Deal, focusing more on relief and reform than just outright recovery, getting the economy, its fundamentals back up to speed and running again, one of the most significant shifts of this entire time period, the most significant changes that we see in this time period, is the position and role of labor in the United States during this time. Historically, as we had said in so many of our other units, and you talked about in your history classes, the government and law and order, the forces of law and order and government, had been rock solid, consistently on the side of corporate America since essentially the beginning of the Republic. We had not seen, except for the 1902 coal strike, where Theodore Roosevelt calls labor management together to help mediate a solution, we had not seen anything near government actively advocating for organized labor or in labor's corner. The 1930s begins to change that, an enormous cultural and social shift in American thinking. Unions historically had been seen as somehow un-American, sort of communist or collective or anti-capitalist in many ways. With the National Industrial Recovery Act, Section 7A, the Wagner Act, was going to call for the recognition of unions and collective bargaining as legitimate. And the United States was going to then give this legitimacy a major push from the backing of the federal government. The discrediting of the notion in the 1920s of the businessman as hero was going to lead to a counter notion of the 1930s with maybe the working man, the laborer, being the hero. And as such, union labor in the 1930s begins its golden age of the next 30 to 40 years with mass union membership and mass union organization. The creation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which begins as a sub-branch of the American Federation of Labor, ultimately splits away under John L. Lewis from the United Mine Workers and focuses on organizing unskilled labor, such as mine workers and United Auto Workers, UAW, etc. And so we see with these automobile strikes in Detroit and Flint, Michigan during this time period, we see the UAW rise to ascendancy as the government by now not necessarily advocating as strongly for corporate America. The corporations are sort of eventually compelled to deal with and settle with these unions. So unions win their first major long-lasting victories, the kind of things that Samuel Gompers and Terence Powderly had struggled for since the 1880s, 1890s with the Knights of Labor and AFL. Bread and butter unionism, hours, wages, compensation, and safety, those issues start to get to be met. Steel strikes as well, the most famous one being the Memorial Day 1937 Republic Steel strike in Chicago, where there's gunfire at this strike as police opens fire on a crowd of protesting workers. In many ways is going to help lead the way towards steel unions, and not steel unions, but steel corporations having to settle, particularly with the war coming, having to settle with their unions and have to make peace with them. One of the last elements of the New Deal as a, not relief, but a reform measure in this vein wound up being the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which establishes minimum wage. So the minimum wage law is established in 1938. We see with Social Security, a defined benefit social old age pension program is set up in 1935. We're dealing with all aspects, if we can, of the society on both ends, the young and the old, the skilled and the unskilled, those who have jobs and those who are looking for jobs. Now, when it comes to the New Deal itself, there were certainly critics of it. The New Deal was controversial at the time. It's been controversial ever since. And critics of the New Deal came in two categories. You had critics from the left, or liberals, who argued that the New Deal was actually just a status quo movement dedicated to benefiting middle-class America. And these critics argued that in many ways, people such as Huey Long, Fada Coughlin, Upton Sinclair, the socialist movement, they argued that the New Deal didn't go far enough to ease suffering. It was too married and committed to status quo. And it really ignored women and minorities. It did not do much for them at all. And lastly, as a moral issue, the whole notion of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, reducing crop prices and crop production, increasing crop prices by reducing crop products and outputs, was seen as almost shocking and immoral, that we would destroy surplus crops when there were people who were going hungry in America. As for conservatives such as critics from the right, business people, corporate America, they saw Roosevelt as being a traitor to his class. They've referenced him as, quote, that man in the White House, close quote. And their argument was that all this taxation and government regulation diminished and constrained and limited the ability of Americans to do what Americans did best, which is create, improvise, be free, and make the economy prosper through creative solutions. There was too much structure, too much regulation. Hoover, for his part, he blamed Europe for the Depression. He believed in the ability of capitalism, in efficiency, individualism, and personal success was only going to allow for private enterprise and voluntarism to solve the Depression. He's historically been seen as a mildly progressive liberal, but at his core belief for Hoover, he believed in a relatively unregulated profit system. That was how he had risen in the world. And this belief, if you tie this together with the fact that there had been no major depression or crisis during his entire maturity, from the 1890s and 1929s, it set him up to be too philosophically rigid, to bend to these new and different conditions. He couldn't change. And so as a result, as we talked about in the first part of this lesson, Hoover becomes labeled in many ways, he's an idealist. He's an ideologue. He's a true believer who's willing to do what's right rather than what's popular. And for doing that, he pays the political price. In Hoover's world, the world of the critics of the New Deal, efficiency and economy became ends in themselves. And he couldn't see, the business people and those that criticized the New Deal, they couldn't see that during this time of crisis, the masses wanted action regardless of what the method was, regardless of the philosophy behind it. So which is why FDR says, you want me to try stuff? I'll try stuff. And people were kind of okay with that, at least the mass population. And that's why I argued in many ways that Hoover was a bridge to the New Deal, because when his philosophy failed, the philosophy of volunteerism, of largely self-contained private sector solutions, the way was then cleared for massive federal aid. But deficit financing and public works were seen overwhelmingly by the conservatives as bad ideas, and the New Deal was seen as eroding in many ways the American core being our self-sufficient way of life. Hoover was convinced that Roosevelt was going to destroy capitalism. And he thought that Hoover's an anti-Keynesian, along with most of the business classes, and they thought that this would destroy the American rugged individualism. Additionally, centralized government control, such as modifications of the court, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and even the Tennessee Valley Authority, were seen as being totalitarian or even unconstitutional. Maybe these New Deal programs weren't even legal, is what conservatives argued. And in the case of the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the High Court agreed. These were overreaches of the government into realms of policy that they had no place. Now, what set President Roosevelt up for the possibility of some sort of overreach like this were the outcomes of the 1936 elections, in both the presidency and in the Senate elections, which were eligible, and the House seats that were all the House seats that were eligible. Franklin Roosevelt wins an enormous landslide in 1936, an overwhelming affirmation in terms of a mandate for him to go forward as he sees it with his New Deal. The Democrats also won in the House and Senate very large majorities, amongst some of the largest majorities ever established in the history of the Republic. So as such, he begins to try to subvert the court. And what he does, this is the so-called court packing scheme, where he wants to increase the number of appointments the president has at the court for any justice who's over 70 years old, saying the workload is too much on him. It was a very transparent and shallow attempt that everyone saw through to allow him to appoint more justices to the court right now so that he could have a high court that would vote in his favor instead of shooting down pieces of policy of his. What this does is it even gets Democrats against Roosevelt. It blunts the effectiveness of the New Deal, because even liberals begin to question, is this really a power grab on the president's part, or what are we doing here? And as such, the New Deal really never has any major movements and major advances in a policy and programmatic sense after 1937. It's sort of a status quo event with modest tinkering around the sides in many ways. In fact, with the AAA and NRA declared unconstitutional, the government does move into soil conservation as a way to kind of still do some of the crop control subsidy things, but the National Industrial Codes go away. The only thing that remains to exist was the Wagner Act for union recognition. By 1938, in fact, Roosevelt is trying to reduce the New Deal. The economy looks good enough that he pulls the plug on some of his programs, reduces some federal spending, and the economy goes back into a quick tailspin, which was, for your purposes, known as the so-called Roosevelt recession of 1938. And so the New Deal muddles through the remaining years of the late 30s, heading towards World War II in many ways. Now, the long view on the New Deal is that some have said that Roosevelt was just too pragmatic. He was too willing to try anything, and he didn't actually have an overarching plan. The New Deal was not a coherent program. It was a bowl of spaghetti. It was a big mishmash of things that were happening, and the economy remains capitalistic, doesn't fundamentally change, but also doesn't fundamentally improve. For the 10 years or so of the New Deal, the 8-9 years of the New Deal, unemployment never significantly changes during this time. It never significantly drops below some of the key benchmark indicators that the Democrats hoped it would drop under. Even in 1938, there were still 10 million Americans jobless. Nevertheless, it's important to understand that the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt definitely transformed the presidency. Many historians argue that he laid the foundation, more than any other 20th century president, for what was known as the so-called imperial presidency. The New Deal is going to form the basis for the entitlement system and the welfare state that subsequent presidential administrations, from Lyndon Johnson through George Bush, the second George Bush, would all build on in many ways. Government, for the first time, acknowledges a responsibility under the New Deal to bring relief to the jobless and resort to deficit spending, that Keynesian idea, in order to stimulate the economy. And so economic institutions will be permanently changed for decades to come. In many of a sense, though, for many Americans, the idea of a government doing something, doing anything, which is opposed to what the American public thought Hoover was being portrayed as, it seemed like hope. It seemed like Roosevelt was the man who was taking them in the right direction, which explains why he will be the only president who's going to serve as president or be elected to serve up to 12 years. Obviously, now constitutionally you can't do that, but it's a unique time and a unique set of circumstances. Did the man make the times or did the times make the man? You see kind of a blending of those in Roosevelt's presidential policies of the 30s. At the end of the day, though, the New Deal was not a radical program, despite what the conservatives said. It didn't represent a break with the past. Many of the New Deal ideas had been ideas the populists had, that the progressives had, and so the pendulum simply swung towards the implementation of those ideas over just the free market laissez-faire model. Liberal historians, if they were going to be critical of the New Deal, they would say it's too status quo. It too much preserved the American system, too much benefited the middle class to the expense of anyone else. Right-wing historians argued the New Deal was socialist, and it produced corruption, it lowered morale, and actually slowed down and blunted the ability of the economy to recover itself. But most historians in general argue that the New Deal was definitely a reform movement in the tradition, in the best tradition of the progressive movement and earlier reform movements we'd seen in American history, and that it benefited middle-class America. The thing that is going to supplant the New Deal in American consciousness and thinking are going to be events that take us around the world and not just to domestic policy anymore. And that is going to be the road that is going to lead us to the Second World War.